The gunslinger found a widow crying beside a burned wagon. He never knew her children would call him father. A gunslinger who killed for 20 years found a burned wagon in the desert. And inside, a woman holding 2 children who would never wake up again. What happened next changed everything he thought he knew about being a man. The mist hung low that morning, thick as ghosts across the valley floor. Jacob Reeves pulled his hat down against the cold and let his horse pick its way through the scrub brush. The animal knew better than he did where to step. After 20 years of running from one town to the next, Jacob had learned to trust things that moved without thinking too much about where they were going. The smell hit him first. Burned wood. Burned leather. Something else underneath that made his stomach turn tight. He'd smelled it before, in other places, after other fights. The kind of smell that stuck to your clothes and followed you into dreams. His horse stopped without being told to. Ahead, through the grey morning air, Jacob could see the dark shape of a wagon. Or what was left of one. The canvas cover had burned away to nothing. The wooden sides stood like black teeth against the pale sky. Smoke still rose from the ashes, thin as prayer. He sat there for a long time, listening. The wind moved through the sage brush with a sound like whispers. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called once and went quiet. No other sounds. No voices calling for help. No horses stamping or harness jingling. Just the awful quiet that comes after terrible things happen. Jacob touched the gun at his hip without thinking about it. Old habits. But this wasn't the kind of trouble that bullets could fix. This was the other kind. The kind that left holes in the world that never filled back up. He climbed down from his horse slow and careful. His boots made soft sounds in the dust. Each step felt heavy, like walking through water. The burned wagon looked bigger as he got closer. Big enough for a family. Big enough for dreams. That's when he saw her. She sat in the dirt beside the wagon, still as stone. Her dress had been blue once, but now it was grey with ash and dust. Her hair hung down around her face like a curtain. She wasn't moving. Wasn't making any sound at all. Jacob stopped walking. Something in his chest went cold and tight. He'd seen grief before. He'd caused enough of it. But this was different. This was the kind of quiet that came from a heart that had broken so complete there weren't any pieces left to make noise with. His voice came out rough as sand. He cleared his throat and tried again. Are you hurt? She didn't look up. Didn't give any sign she'd heard him at all. Just sat there holding something in her lap. Something small and still. Jacob took another step closer. Then another. His shadow fell across her and she looked up for the first time. Her eyes were dry, but they looked like they'd forgotten how tears worked. Like they'd used them all up and had nothing left. They're not moving, she said. Her voice was small and far away. I keep waiting for them to move, but they're not moving anymore. Jacob looked down at what she held. 2 children. A boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8 years old. Their faces were peaceful, like they were just sleeping. But Jacob knew better. He'd seen enough death to know the difference between sleeping and the other thing. The woman's hands were gentle on their hair, smoothing it down the way mothers do, the way his own mother used to do, before the fever took her and left him alone in a world too big and too hard for a boy of 12. What happened here? Jacob asked, though he already knew. Raiders, most likely. The kind of men who took what they wanted and burned what they couldn't carry. The kind of men he'd been, once upon a time, before he learned that some things you take from people never grow back. We were heading to California, the woman said. Still looking down at the children. Still smoothing their hair. John said there was good land there. Good water. Said we could build something clean and new. She was quiet for a long time. Jacob waited. Sometimes grief needed room to find its words. They came in the night, she said finally. 3 men. Maybe 4. John tried to fight them off. She nodded toward the burned wagon. He's in there. What's left of him? Jacob felt something twist in his gut. A family. Heading west with hopes big as the sky. Cut down for what? A few dollars? A wagon full of tools and dreams? It made him sick. Made him think of all the wagons he'd burned. All the dreams he'd snuffed out like candles. I should have died too, the woman whispered. Should have been with them. But I hid. Like a coward. Let them die and hid in the brush like an animal. That ain't cowardly, Jakob said. That's staying alive. That's what they would have wanted. She looked up at him then. Really looked, like she was seeing him for the first time. Are you one of them? Come back to finish what they started. Jakob felt the question like a punch. Because once, maybe, he could have been. Once, he was the kind of man who rode with raiders and took what he wanted. But that was before. Before he learned that every life you take carries weight. Before he learned that killing was easy but living with it was the hard part. No, he said. I'm not one of them. The woman studied his face. Looking for lies, maybe. Looking for danger. But whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she nodded and looked back down at the children. Their names were Sarah and Tommy, she said. Sarah wanted to be a teacher. Tommy wanted to raise horses. Her voice broke a little on the words. They'll never get to do any of those things now. Jakob knelt down in the dust beside her, close enough to see the freckles on the little girl's nose. Close enough to see that the boy had his father's strong chin. Close enough to feel the weight of all the tomorrows that would never come. What's your name? He asked. Mary, she said. Mary Holloway. All of them. It ain't right to leave them like this. She looked at him with those empty eyes. Why would you do that? You don't know us. We are nothing to you. Jakob was quiet for a long time, thinking about her question. Why would he? He had his own troubles. His own ghosts chasing him across the desert. His own reasons to keep riding and not look back. But looking at Mary Holloway sitting in the dust with her dead children, he thought about all the mothers he'd made cry. All the children who'd grown up without fathers because of things he'd done. All the wagons he'd burned and all the dreams he'd scattered to the wind. Maybe this was how you started to balance the scales. Maybe this was how you began to pay back a debt too big to ever settle complete. Because some things are right to do, he said finally. And some things ain't. And leaving good people unburied in the desert ain't right, no matter what else is true. Mary nodded slow, like she was thinking about his words. Like she was trying to decide if she could trust them. Trust him. The sun was getting higher now. The mist was burning off, leaving the world sharp and clear and bright. Soon it would be hot. Soon the desert would claim what was left if they didn't act. Jakob stood up and brushed the dust off his knees. I'll get some tools from my pack, he said. We'll dig them graves up on that rise there, where they can see the mountains. Where the view is good. Mary looked up at him one more time. Something different in her eyes now. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too much to ask for. But maybe something like trust. Something like the first small crack in a wall that had been built too high and too thick. All right, she said. All right, mister? Jakob, he said. Jakob Reeves. As he walked back to his horse to get the shovels, Jakob found himself wondering what kind of man John Holloway had been. What kind of father? What kind of husband? The kind who sang his children to sleep, maybe. The kind who held his wife's hand when the nights got cold. The kind of man Jakob had never learned how to be. The graves were finished by noon. 4 mounds of earth on the rise overlooking the valley, each one marked with a cross Jakob had carved from wagon wood. The crosses weren't pretty, but they were straight and true. That seemed more important than beauty in a place like this. Mary stood between the small graves, her hands folded in front of her dress. She hadn't cried yet. Not once in all the hours they'd worked. Jakob wondered if the tears were frozen somewhere inside her, like water in a deep well that hadn't seen sun in too long. Should we say words? She asked. Her voice was quiet as wind through grass. Jakob pulled off his hat and held it against his chest. I ain't much for preaching, he said. But I reckon they knew they were loved. That counts for something. Mary nodded. She reached down and picked up a handful of dirt, letting it fall through her fingers onto Sarah's grave. Then Tommy's. Then she walked to where her husband lay and did the same thing there. Goodbye, she whispered. Just that one word, but it carried the weight of everything else she couldn't say. They stood there in the heat for a long while. The sun beat down hard and the air shimmered like water over the desert floor. Somewhere in the distance, a buzzard circled lazy and patient, waiting for them to leave so it could go back to its business. What now? Mary asked. Jacob looked at her standing there in her ash-stained dress, alone in the world with nothing but the clothes on her back. He thought about riding away, getting back on his horse and continuing south toward the border, toward whatever was waiting for him in Mexico. But when he opened his mouth to say goodbye, different words came out instead. "There's a town about 2 days' ride from here," he said. "Bitter Creek. Not much to look at, but there's decent people there. A church. Maybe work for someone with your skills." "What skills?" Mary laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was a farmer's wife. I know how to cook beans and mend clothes and tend a garden." "What use is that to anyone now?" "More use than you think," Jacob said. "Decent cooking is worth its weight in gold in these parts. And there ain't many folks who know how to make things grow in ground this hard." He saw her considering this, turning it over in her mind like a stone she was trying to decide whether to keep or throw away. "You don't have to come with me," she said. "I know you got your own path to follow." Jacob looked at the graves one more time. At the burned wagon. At the woman standing alone in the dust. He thought about all the paths he'd followed in his life. Most of them had led to dark places. Maybe it was time to try a different direction. 2 days ain't so long, he said. I can spare 2 days. They buried what was left of the wagon and its contents in a shallow pit. Most everything was ruined by fire and smoke, but Mary found a few things worth saving. A small wooden box that held her mother's wedding ring. A Bible with pages brown around the edges but still readable. A child's doll made of corn husks and string. She held the doll for a long time, turning it over in her hands. Sarah made this last Christmas, she said. Spent weeks on it. Said she was going to give it to her first daughter someday. Jacob watched her face, saw the way pain moved across it like clouds across the sun. You should keep it, he said. For remembering. Mary tucked the doll into the wooden box with the ring and the Bible. I don't think I need help remembering, she said. But she kept it anyway. They rode south through the afternoon heat. Jacob led the way on his bay horse while Mary rode double behind him. She sat straight and still, her arms around his waist but holding herself careful, like she was afraid to take up too much room in the world. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't sound hollow in the face of what had happened. But sometimes Jacob felt her watching him, studying the back of his head like she was trying to solve some puzzle he carried there. When the sun started getting low, they found a place to camp beside a small creek. The water was sweet and cold, and Jacob watched Mary cup it in her hands and drink like she'd forgotten what good water tasted like. We should eat something, Jacob said. He had jerky and hardtack in his saddlebags. Trail food, but it would keep them going. Mary shook her head. I'm not hungry. You need to eat anyway, Jacob said. Not harsh, but firm. Your body don't care if you're grieving. It still needs fuel. He built a small fire and boiled coffee in his tin pot. The smell rose up with the smoke, sharp and bitter and somehow comforting. Mary sat across the fire from him, staring into the flames like they might show her something she needed to see. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. Jacob looked up from poking at the fire with a stick. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself all day. I told you, he said. Some things are right to do. That's not an answer, Mary said. That's just words. I want to know why. Really why? Jacob was quiet for a long time. He thought about the truth, about all the things he'd done that would make her run screaming into the desert if she knew. About the men he'd killed and the towns he'd burned and the reasons he couldn't go back east where the law had long arms and longer memories. Because I ain't always done the right thing, he said finally. And maybe this is how you start to balance that out. Mary studied his face in the firelight. You're running from something, she said. It wasn't a question. We are all running from something, Jacob said. The trick is knowing when to stop. The fire burned down to coals. Jacob rolled out his bedroll on one side of the dying embers and gave Mary his spare blanket. She wrapped it around herself and lay down on the other side, using her wooden box as a pillow. Mr. Reeves, she said after they'd been quiet for a while. Jacob, he said. Just Jacob. Jacob, do you think they're together? John, and the children? Somewhere. Jakob looked up at the stars scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. He'd never been much for religion, never had much use for preachers and their promises about what came after. But looking at those stars, thinking about Mary's question, he found himself hoping there was something more than just dirt and darkness waiting at the end. "I think love don't just disappear," he said. "I think it has to go somewhere." Mary was quiet after that, but Jakob could tell she was still awake by the way she breathed. Still thinking, still carrying the weight of her grief like stones in her pockets. When morning came, they broke camp early and continued south. The land began to change as they rode. Less desert, more grass. Green things growing beside the creek beds. Signs that rain fell here sometimes and life could take root if it was stubborn enough. "It's prettier than I expected," Mary said. The first time she'd spoken without being asked a question. "Gets prettier the further south you go," Jakob said. "More water. Better soil. A person could make a life here if they had a mind to." He felt her shift behind him on the horse. "Is that what you're planning to do? Make a life here?" Jakob thought about that. He'd been running for so long he'd almost forgotten there might be another choice. That a man could stop moving and put down roots somewhere. Build something instead of always tearing things down. "Maybe," he said, "if I can figure out how." They crested a hill and saw Bitter Creek spread out in the valley below. It wasn't much to look at. Maybe 30 buildings scattered along both sides of a dusty main street. A church with a leaning steeple. A general store with paint peeling off its sides. The kind of place that existed because someone had needed it once and it had been too stubborn to die when that need passed. But there were people moving around down there. Children playing in the street. Smoke rising from chimneys. The signs of a place where life went on despite everything that tried to stop it. "It looks peaceful," Mary said, and Jakob heard something like surprise in her voice. Like she'd forgotten places like this existed. They rode down into the town slow and careful. Jakob kept his hand away from his gun but ready to move fast if he needed to. You never knew what kind of welcome a stranger might get in a place like this. The people they passed looked at them with curious eyes but friendly enough nods. A woman hanging laundry stopped to wave. Children playing with hoops and sticks paused their game to stare at the newcomers. Jakob pulled up in front of the church. It seemed like the right place to start. Churches usually knew who needed help and who might be willing to give it. The preacher was a thin man with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd done honest work. He listened to Jakob's carefully edited version of their story without interrupting. When Jakob finished, the preacher was quiet for a moment, thinking, "Mrs. Patterson, who runs the boarding house, could probably use help in the kitchen," he said finally. "And there's always work for someone who knows how to tend a garden. The soil here's willing enough if you know how to talk to it right." Mary looked at Jakob, then back at the preacher. "I'd be grateful for the chance," she said. As they walked away from the church toward the boarding house, Jakob felt something strange in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. Hope. Small and fragile as a seed, but growing despite the salt ground of his past. 3 weeks passed like quiet water. Mary found her place at the boarding house, her hands busy with bread dough and garden soil. Jakob stayed longer than he'd planned, telling himself it was just until she got settled. Just until he was sure she'd be safe. But the truth was harder than that. The truth was he'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up somewhere, and not wonder if today was the day he'd have to run again. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house sat at the end of Main Street like a tired old woman resting her bones. The rooms were small and the floors creaked, but the windows were clean and the meals came regular. Jakob paid for a room by the week and tried to convince himself it was temporary. Mary worked in the kitchen and the garden behind the house. Jakob watched her through his window sometimes, saw the way she moved among the bean plants and tomato vines like she was having quiet conversations with them. Her hands were gentle but sure. Things grew for her that wouldn't grow for anyone else. The other boarders were decent folks. A traveling preacher with soft eyes and careful words. An old prospector who'd given up looking for gold but hadn't given up hope. A schoolteacher named Miss Chen who spoke 3 languages and played piano like angels singing. Jakob kept to himself mostly. Old habits. But sometimes in the evening he'd sit on the porch with the others and listen to Miss Chen play. The music drifted out through the open windows and mixed with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. It was peaceful in a way that made his chest tight with something he couldn't name. "You play?" Mary asked him one night. They were sitting on the porch steps, watching fireflies dance in the garden. "No," Jakob said. "Never learned." "John played fiddle," Mary said. "Not well, but he played with his whole heart. Said that was what mattered." She was talking about her husband more now. Small memories that slipped out when she wasn't guarding against them. Jakob took it as a good sign. Grief that could speak its name was grief that might someday learn to heal. "Must have been something," he said. "Having music in the house." Mary looked at him sideways. "You could learn. Miss Chen gives lessons." Jakob shook his head. "Hands like mine weren't made for music." "Maybe they were made for other things," Mary said quietly. Jakob didn't ask what she meant, but he thought about it later, lying in his narrow bed listening to the wind move through the eaves. What were hands like his made for? He'd used them to kill and steal and hurt. But lately he'd used them to dig graves and build fires and help Mary carry water from the well. Maybe hands could learn new purposes, just like hearts could. The riders came on a Thursday morning when the sky was heavy with clouds that promised rain but wouldn't deliver. Jakob was helping Mary hang laundry in the garden when he heard the sound of horses approaching fast. Too fast for casual travelers. Too urgent for good news. He straightened up, his hand moving toward his gun without thinking. Old reflexes. Old fears that never really went away, just learned to sleep light. Jakob, Mary's voice was tight with concern. She'd learned to read his moods, the way his body changed when danger was near. "Go inside," he said. Not harsh, but firm. "Go inside and stay there." 3 men rode into the yard like they owned it. Like they owned everything they could see and some things they couldn't. Jakob recognized the way they sat their horses, the way they wore their guns. Men who took what they wanted and killed anyone who tried to stop them. Men like he used to be. The one in front was older than the other 2, with silver hair under a black hat and eyes like winter morning. He had silver spurs that caught the light when he moved, and a smile that never reached past his teeth. "Well, well," the man said, his voice smooth as whiskey and twice as dangerous. "Jakob Reeves. Been a long time." Jakob's blood went cold. He knew that voice. Knew it from dreams that woke him up sweating in the middle of the night. "Carlyle," he said. "You remember." Carlyle's smile got wider but no warmer. "I was starting to wonder if you'd forgotten your old friends." "We ain't friends," Jakob said. "We never were." "Now that hurts my feelings," Carlyle said. He swung down from his horse with practiced ease, his spurs ringing against his boot heels. "After all we've been through together. All the good times we had." The other 2 men stayed mounted but their hands rested easy on their gun butts. Ready for whatever their boss decided needed doing. Jakob counted the distance between himself and cover. Measured his chances. They weren't good. "What do you want, Carlyle?" Jakob asked. "Straight to business." "I always liked that about you." Carlyle walked closer, his boots loud in the quiet yard. "You owe me, Jakob. You owe me big." "I don't owe you nothing." "The bank job in Yuma," Carlyle said. "Remember? You rode off with my share. Left me and the boys to face the law alone." Jakob remembered. Remembered the bank. Remembered the shots fired and the blood on the floor. Remembered riding away from Yuma with saddlebags full of money and a heart full of disgust for what they'd done. What he'd done. "That money wasn't yours," Jakob said. "Wasn't mine either. It belonged to people who worked for it." "Pretty words," Carlyle said. "But debt is debt. With interest, you owe me about $5,000. Jakob laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't have $5,000. I don't have 500. "I know," Carlyle said. "Which is why I'm willing to accept payment another way." He nodded toward the boarding house. Toward the windows where Jakob knew Mary was watching, probably scared and confused and wondering what kind of man she'd trusted to bring her to this place. "Pretty woman," Carlyle said. "Good hands. Clean. The kind of woman who'd be worth quite a bit to the right buyer." Something cold and terrible moved through Jakob's chest. something that made his vision go red around the edges and his hand twitched toward his gun. "You touch her," he said, his voice low and deadly, "and I'll kill you where you stand." "There's the Jakob I remember," Carlyle said, laughing. "All fire and brimstone when someone threatens what's his. Tell me, how long you been playing house with her? She know what you really are." Jakob felt the weight of his past settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. All the things he'd done. All the people he'd hurt. All the reasons he'd been running for so long. "She's got nothing to do with this," Jakob said. "This is between you and me." "Everything's got to do with everything," Carlyle said. "That's the way the world works. Your choices. Your consequences. Your woman pays the price." Thunder rumbled overhead, long and low. The air smelled like rain and violence and all the things that couldn't be undone. "I'll give you until tomorrow morning," Carlyle said. "Have my money or we take what we came for." He swung back up into his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd never doubted he'd get what he wanted. "Nice little town you got here. Shame if something happened to it." The three riders turned and headed back toward the main street, their horses hooves raising dust that hung in the still air like smoke. Jakob watched them go and felt something breaking inside his chest. Not his heart. That had been broken for years. Something deeper. Something he'd been trying to build back up one small piece at a time. Mary came out of the house, her face pale but determined. "Who were they?" she asked. Jakob looked at her standing there in her simple blue dress, her hair catching what little light leaked through the grey clouds. She was clean and good and everything he'd never deserved. Everything he'd somehow found anyway. "Nobody," he said. But they both knew it was a lie. Jakob, her voice was steady but he could hear the fear underneath it. What did they want? He thought about telling her the truth. About the banks he'd robbed and the men he'd killed and all the reasons Carlyle had tracked him here. About the debt that could never really be paid and the past that followed a man like his own shadow. But looking at her face, seeing the trust there despite everything, he found himself saying something else instead. "They wanted me to remember who I used to be," he said. "But I ain't that man anymore." Mary studied his face for a long moment. Then she stepped closer and put her hand on his arm. Her touch was light but it felt like an anchor. Like something solid in a world that was shifting under his feet. "Then don't be," she said simply. Thunder rolled again, closer this time. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, striking the dusty ground with sounds like scattered coins. Jakob looked up at the darkening sky and wondered if some storms were too big to weather, no matter how much you changed or how hard you tried to outrun what you'd done. The rain was coming whether they were ready for it or not. The storm that had been building for days finally broke that night. Rain came down in sheets that turned the dust to mud and filled the dry creek beds until they sang with rushing water. Jakob stood at his window and watched lightning split the sky, counting the seconds between flash and thunder. When morning came, the world looked different. Washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and growing things. Puddles reflected the pale sky like scattered mirrors, and everything that had been brown and brittle yesterday was touched with green. Jakob found Mary in the garden behind the boarding house, kneeling in the mud between rows of beans that had doubled in size overnight. Her dress was soaked through and her hair hung in damp strings around her face, but she was smiling. Really smiling, for the first time since he'd known her. "Look," she said, holding up a handful of earth. It was dark and rich, nothing like the hard-packed dust it had been the day before. "It's good soil." It was always good soil. It just needed water. Jakob knelt beside her in the mud, not caring about his clothes. "Like people," he said. Mary looked at him then, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen there before. Hope, maybe. Or something deeper than hope. Something that looked like belief in tomorrow. "Carlyle's gone," Jakob said. He'd checked that morning, riding out before dawn to the camp where the three men had made their fire. Nothing left but cold ashes and hoofprints heading north. He won't be back. It was true, though the truth was more complicated than that. Jakob had spent the night walking through the rain, thinking about choices and consequences and what a man owed to his past versus what he owed to his future. When the storm broke, he'd made his decision. He'd found Carlyle's camp just as the first light touched the eastern hills. The three men were huddled around a dying fire, their horses stamping and restless in the pre-dawn cold. Jacob had stepped out of the shadows with his gun drawn and his mind clear as glass. "You want your money," he'd said. "Here it is." But instead of gold or paper bills, he'd thrown something else at Carlyle's feet. His reputation. His past. The fear that men like Carlyle used to control men like he used to be. "I ain't running anymore," Jacob had said. "And I ain't paying debts I don't owe. You want to kill me for that? Go ahead and try. But you touch that woman or anyone in that town, and I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth." Carlyle had studied him for a long moment, seeing something in Jacob's face that made him reconsider whatever he'd been planning. Maybe he saw that Jacob wasn't bluffing. Maybe he saw that a man with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than any reputation. "You've gone soft, Reeves," Carlyle had said finally. But he'd mounted his horse anyway. "This ain't over." "Yeah, it is," Jacob had replied. And somehow, saying it had made it true. Now, kneeling in Mary's garden with mud on his knees and rain still dripping from the eaves, Jacob felt something shift inside his chest. Like a door he'd kept locked for years was finally opening. "What will you do now?" Mary asked. She was still holding that handful of dark earth, turning it over in her palms like it was precious. Jacob looked around at the garden, at the boarding house with its crooked shutters and welcoming porch, at the town beyond where people were starting their day without fear. "I was thinking about staying," he said. "If that's all right with you." Mary's smile was small but real. "I'd like that," she said. They worked in the garden together as the sun climbed higher. Jacob's hands, so used to guns and violence, learned the gentle art of coaxing life from soil. Mary showed him how to thin the seedlings so they'd have room to grow, how to tell a weed from a bean plant, how to read the signs that told you when something needed more water or more sun. "You're a fast learner," she said as they moved down the rows together. "Good teacher," Jacob replied. But it was more than that. It was like some part of him had been waiting his whole life to put his hands in dirt and help things grow instead of tearing them down. Every small green shoot that pushed up through the dark soil felt like a promise. Like proof that broken ground could heal if you tended it right. The other boarders came and went throughout the morning, stopping to admire the overnight transformation of the garden. Mrs. Patterson brought them coffee and biscuits, shaking her head at the state of their clothes but smiling anyway. Miss Chen played soft melodies on her piano that drifted through the open windows and mixed with the sound of birdsong and Mary's quiet laughter. It was peaceful in a way that made Jacob's chest tight with gratitude he didn't know how to express. In the afternoon, they walked to the church where the preacher was helping some of the town's children plant flowers beside the front steps. Jacob watched Mary kneel down beside a little girl with pigtails and patient eyes, showing her how to make a hole just the right size for a wildflower seed. "Like this?" the girl asked, her small hands careful and sure. "Perfect," Mary said. "Now cover it up gentle and give it a little water." Plants are like people. They need care to grow strong. Jacob saw something pass across Mary's face then. A shadow of the grief that would always live inside her, but softer now. Like rain clouds that had spent their fury and were learning how to let sunshine through. The little girl planted her seed and patted the soil down with tiny hands. "Will it be pretty?" she asked. "All growing things are pretty," Mary said. "Even when they start small and plain. Especially then." That evening, Jacob sat on the porch with his guitar. He'd bought it from the general store that afternoon, using money he'd saved from odd jobs around town. His fingers were clumsy on the strings at first, but Miss Chen had given him his first lesson and promised more to come. Mary sat beside him in the porch swing, mending a tear in one of his shirts. The domestic intimacy of it should have scared him. A month ago, it would have sent him running for his horse and the open road. But now it felt natural as breathing. "Play something," she said without looking up from her stitching. Jacob tried a simple melody Miss Chen had taught him. The notes came out rough and uncertain, but they were notes all the same. Music where there had been silence. Harmony where there had been discord. "It's beautiful," Mary said, and Jacob knew she meant it despite the mistakes. "It's a beginning," he said. That night, Jacob hung his gun belt on a peg beside the door of his room. Not thrown away or buried, but set aside. Like a tool he might need someday but hoped he never would. Tomorrow he'd look into buying some land. A few acres outside town where a man could build a house and plant crops and maybe learn what it meant to have roots. He thought about writing a letter to his sister back in Missouri. The one who'd stopped writing years ago when the letters from home had gotten too painful to answer. Maybe it was time to try again. Time to tell her that her little brother was still alive and had finally found something worth living for. Mary was in her own room across the hall, but Jakob could hear her moving around, getting ready for bed. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. The kind of sounds that said tomorrow would come and the day after that and the one after that, stretching out like a road that led somewhere good instead of just away from something bad. Outside, the night was full of the sounds that came after rain. Frogs singing in the creek beds. The whisper of wind through wet grass. The distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night. It was a symphony of life continuing, of the world healing itself after the storm. Jakob closed his eyes and listened to it all. For the first time in 20 years, he fell asleep without checking the lock on his door or positioning his boots for a quick escape. He slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who had finally found his way home. When he woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through his window and he could hear Mary humming in the garden below. The melody was one he recognized from Miss Chen's piano, transformed into something new by Mary's voice. Something that sounded like contentment. Like joy discovered in the simple act of tending growing things. Jakob dressed quickly and headed downstairs. There was work to do in the garden, and a life to build, and a woman who taught him that the strongest victories weren't won with guns but with the courage to put them down and pick up something better. The morning light fell across new ground, and everything it touched seemed to glow with possibility.